Hey guys, I said a few weeks ago that videos might be sporadic, and unfortunately that's turned out to be the case. I'm not going anywhere, still dedicated to this channel, but I've been finding it hard to squeeze filming into my life at the moment. I'll be making a video in the coming days about a life update because some fun bookish things have been happening. But for now, let's get into the top 5 books that I read in January. Yes, it is almost the middle of February. And if you're wondering why this isn't a full wrap-up, I talked about that decision in a video I made about 2018 channel changes, so I'll link that below with the timestamp. These are in no particular order, but the first happens to be the first book I read in 2018, the novel After You'd Gone by Maggie O'Farrell. This was her debut, published in 2000, and we open with a woman named Alice who steps into traffic at the end of the first chapter, possibly intentionally. She goes into a coma, and as her family visits her, we get flashbacks of their complicated dynamics over the years. We also learn early on that Alice's relationship with a man named John recently ended. This is one of those books that I just loved the experience of reading. It has its share of flaws, and they might bother you more than they bothered me, so I want to talk about those first. O'Farrell's writing is piercingly beautiful at times. It's somewhat surreal and fractured, but she has a tendency to use 2 adjectives, or 3, or 4, where 1 would have sufficed, and these dangling and often useless words interrupt the flow and make everything a bit cluttered. Now this isn't it takes one to know one situation, because that's one of the greatest flaws in my own writing. I almost never leave an adjective alone when I could give it a buddy. Another meh thing is the book sets you up to expect family revelations. They're your stereotypical family secrets, so plot-wise, this is pretty by the numbers, at least in that respect. And the last main complaint I have is the insta-love. There are several cases in here. Now, there are 2 problems with insta-love, and this book only suffers from one of them. So one problem is that it makes the author look lazy, like you couldn't be bothered to write the beginnings of a relationship, and it all does get to feel a little lazy in here. But the other thing that makes insta-love frustrating for readers is that it can cheapen a fictional relationship, make it feel like a blatant authorial machination as opposed to something complex that you can truly get invested in. After You'd Gone avoids this problem because the relationship between Alice and John is wonderfully drawn. And it's funny because neither of them is an especially memorable character, but their relationship is so true and raw and almost like a character in itself. I can't remember reading a better portrait of what it's like to be completely comfortable with another person and to look forward to seeing that person every day, and to know near the beginning that this relationship doesn't last is horrible, but O'Farrell handles it so gracefully. I felt really emotionally fragile after reading this book. I took a long bath and sort of cried, not like a steady cry, it was more like leakage, like my feelings taking their time puttering down my face. What I really loved was the tone of this book. The whole story occurs in that territory where your throat closes up and you just feel this ache in a deep part of yourself. Also, one of the characters has an axolotl as a pet, and I'm not sure if this is a reference to the Julio Cortázar story, but that's how I took it, because that's about a foreigner in Paris who feels adrift. So he goes to the aquarium every day to watch the axolotl in their tank, and eventually he transforms into one of them. Great story, go read it, I'll link it below. But the atmosphere of loneliness and displacement in that story is a perfect match for how Alice feels at the beginning of this book. So I can't put my finger on why the full package resonated with me the way it did. I was a little depressed at the time. That could have contributed to it, who knows. But I've decided to read all of Maggie O'Farrell, and I'm really excited for the rest of her books. Next is a short story collection that most of you will be familiar with, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Campbell. This was my Christmas gift to myself. Now, to be completely honest here, one of the nicest things about my new wrap-up format is that I could have read this book and not commented on it if I didn't like it. So you can trust that I'm bringing it up voluntarily because I really did enjoy it. This collection features 12 stories, mostly connected by the theme of storytelling, with a lot of elements from fairy tales and folk tales as well. Now, I'm leery of descriptions of magical realist or fantastical short story collections. The weird factor doesn't excite me like it seems to excite a lot of other people. To me, it's sort of like girls with jelly beans for eyes, dancing candy canes, dogs who carved the moon into a giant bone. Look, I just came up with a short story collection of breathtaking imagination. So it all comes down to the execution of the weird ideas and if there's realized thematic intent behind them. And this collection succeeds on both levels. I loved how clean the writing is in this book. My brain was really craving that at the time. Sometimes I get a little tired of beautiful, elaborate writing that I have to go back and reread to figure out what's happening. I'm a big fan of crisp writing with lots of emotional subtext, and that's exactly what Jen achieves. But my favorite thing about these stories is the recurring images and themes that make it feel like a cohesive collection. So for example, the second story is called Jacob and is about a little boy who doesn't understand what's happening to his older sister. She used to be called Kath, but now she's changed her name to Anna. And so Jacob calls her Kath Anna. And he worries at one point that she has two souls. And a later story is called Little Deaths and is about people in a town where you can capture ghosts and sell them in jars. But these ghosts come from humans. They're actually little hiccups of memory. And people disagree about whether giving up these bits of yourself is a loss or a death of some kind. And this image of souls existing outside of bodies and pieces of yourself dying made me think back to the ideas in Jacob. And there were so many of these quiet moments that made me want to rethink earlier moments in stories and recontextualize them. My favorite story was Aunt Libby's Coffin Hotel, which is about a hotel that rips people off by pretending to reconnect them to the voices of their loved ones. And another one of my favorites was one of the shortest ones called In the Dark. It had a real Twilight Zone vibe to me. It's just a snapshot of a bizarre interaction, but I reread it a few times and I'm still thinking about that story. So I recommend this as a super readable and thought-provoking collection. And I'll leave a link below to an interview with Jen at the Lush Book Club event with Anna James, if you're looking for some inspiration to pick this up sooner rather than later. Now, because the epigraph in this collection is from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Jen was clearly influenced by questions about the nature of bodies and souls, and because I DNF'd Frankenstein in high school, I decided to give Shelley another go. I didn't know while reading this that it's the 200th anniversary of its original publication. That was a serendipitous thing. And I didn't read the 1818 edition. This is the heavily edited version that Mary Shelley published in 1831. This is widely considered the first work of science fiction and has had an incalculable influence on all the literature that followed. And even if you don't plan to read the full novel, I encourage you to look up how this story came into being and also to read a little bit about Mary and Percy Shelley because there's some wild stuff there. The basic famous story is that Victor Frankenstein, a young Swiss scientist, creates a being with a human-like but monstrous form, and this being ultimately brings about Frankenstein's doom. Now, I don't think the writing is very good, and that's not something I would have felt confident saying about a classic even a few years ago, but really, to me, Shelley's style is quite labored. And I don't say that because it's 19th century. She's simply not the wordsmith that so many of her contemporaries were. In many ways, Frankenstein is a shining example of the Romantic style. From the get-go, it reminded me so much of The Sorrows of Young Werther by the German writer Goethe, and so it made me smile when later in the book, the creature reads The Sorrows of Young Werther alongside Paradise Lost and Plutarch's Lives, the three most popular bedtime stories, you know. But this book is an absolute effusion of emotion. I lost track of how many times words like horror and anguish and despair appeared. It is lamentation upon lamentation, and I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of delicious in that respect. But this also serves a narrative purpose, of course, because such horrific things happen to Frankenstein, and early on he reaches the limits of expression, and there aren't any stronger words he could use to describe his loss. Language fails him. However, it's really the themes that make this novel. They're wonderful to think about and presented with such ambiguity. So one of the things I loved tracking was how Frankenstein both accepts and shirks responsibility for his actions, because on the one hand, he repeatedly castigates himself for his original decision to create the monster. But on the other, he's not especially reflective about the rest of his decisions, and he often frames his story as a product of fate, that he was destined for agony, not that he continually invited it into his life. There's also a debate to be had about the morality of Frankenstein's reaction to his own creation. He hardly dwells on this point. He's much more focused on his own hubris in assuming the role of God. But in a lot of ways, Frankenstein fails as a creator, not because he's playing God, but because he's playing God poorly. For one thing, he never names his creation, and what a critical oversight when you consider the importance of the act of naming in the book of Genesis. And then for another, he immediately casts judgment on the creature because of the way it looks. And Frankenstein never fully considers the implications of that instinct to disown this being because it's hideous, and to assume that the character of the monster is reflected in its physical appearance. There are also perennially relevant ideas in here about the ethics of science, and how humans so often treat science as if what can we do is the only important question, and what should we do never really comes into play. So you could chew on the themes in this book and the complicated way they're presented for days. It's fantastic for that. Overall, not a fun read. I had to push through, but definitely a rewarding one. Fourth to mention is In the Woods by Tana. This is a crime drama, the first in her Dublin Murder Squad series, which is incredibly popular. I have a lot of positive things to say about this, some negative too, and then some neutral comments, because this fell victim to an expectations versus reality scenario. So I'm going to talk about all that in a separate video coming soon. And lastly is The Golden Fool by Hobb, second book in her third epic fantasy trilogy, the Tawny Man series. This might be the fourth or fifth time I've said this, but let's be real, very few people watch every one of my videos. So when I finish this series, I'm going to do a non-spoiler overview video of Hobb's first three trilogies, and it won't just be gushing. I do have critiques, but this specific book was fantastic. Losing light, so good thing I'm wrapping this up. Let me know what you think about these 5 books, and hopefully I'll be popping up in your feeds a little more regularly from now on. Bye guys, thanks for watching.